11 men had already told him no. 11 in 3 weeks. Samuel Reed had counted them the way he counted everything, because counting was the one thing the world had never been able to take from him. 11 closed doors, 11 careful faces, 11 versions of the same soft word dressed up in different clothes, every one of them meaning the same thing. Not your, not here, not today. And now the money in his coat was thin enough that he could feel exactly how many days he had left inside it. Not many, fewer than a man likes to know about himself. So when Samuel stepped into the noise and the dust of Shoshone that afternoon, he had already made a quiet decision, the kind a proud man only makes when pride has become a luxury he can no longer afford. He would stop saying what he used to believe, because that was the strange part. This tired man with the worn valise and the hat already coming off his head, this man had a skill, a rare one, the kind that had once kept 100 men alive through a mountain winter, and it was the very thing that kept getting him turned away. He didn't know it yet. He didn't know that the next door he opened would be the last one he'd ever need to, or that the woman on the other side of it would test him, doubt him, correct him, and then quietly rearrange the entire shape of her life to make room for him in it. He only knew he was hungry. He only knew he needed work. He had no idea he was about to walk straight into the rest of his life. Shoshone in 1888 was a railroad town, and it sounded like what? Iron on iron, the long complaint of a whistle somewhere past the depot, dust that never fully settled because something was always moving through it. Meant wagons, freight, ambition. It was the kind of place that swallowed strangers whole and forgot their names by supper. 2 streets back from all that noise sat the Bennett Eating House. It wasn't grand, it didn't need to be. It was clean, and it was warm, and it ran, and in a town like Shoshone, running well was rarer and worth more than grand. Inside, behind the service counter, stood the woman who made it run. Louisa Bennett had a pencil stub in her hand and a supplier's note under her eyes. And she read it the way she read everything, like she expected somebody, somewhere, to be trying to shortchange her, and she intended to catch them at it. Behind her, in the heat and clatter of the kitchen, Agnes Doyle ruled with the flat authority of a woman who had never once burned a thing she didn't mean to, and a young woman named Minnie Lyle moved plates through the narrow back passage so smoothly you'd have sworn she'd been born carrying them. It was Louisa's place. Every board of it, she had built it and kept it without asking any man's leave, which, in that year, in that country, was its own quiet miracle that nobody thought to call what. Then the door opened, and a man stepped in with his hat already in his hand. He didn't swagger. That was the first thing. Men came through that door all day. Drummers and drifters and railroad men flush with a week's pay, and most of them came in loud, taking up room, sure of their welcome before they'd earned it. This one came in quiet, hat off, valise in one hand, tied around the eyes in a way that went deeper than one bad night. He stood like a man who was used to being looked over, and had made a kind of peace with it. "Ma'am," he said. Louisa didn't answer right away. She let him stand there. It wasn't unkindness. It was habit. You learn things about people in the second before you spoke to them. Wondering, he went on, "If you've got any honest work needs doing." "What kind?" "Any kind. Wood, water, washing, carrying." She studied him the way she studied a delivery she wasn't yet sure she should sign for. There was something in how he held himself that didn't match the words. The words were a man asking for scraps. The bearing was something else. She couldn't have named it. "Not yet." "And," she said, "if I haven't." He didn't flinch. She noticed that too. "Then I'll ask down the street." He said it plainly, without heat, without begging. "I just need food and a place to sleep." He said it the way another man might mention the weather. Not a place, a fact, and something about that, the sheer lack of performance in it, made Louisa set her pencil down. She told him straight what she was and wasn't offering, because that was the only way she knew how to say anything. This was not charity. She said so out loud. The way she'd tell a supplier a price wasn't fair. If he worked, she paid him 3 days, a trial, no more, to see how a man handled himself when nobody was standing over him. Meals through the term, the small room off the back passage, the one, barely wide enough for a cot, his to use as long as he was earning it. Ordinary backhouse work. Nothing fine, nothing that asked for a trust he hadn't earned. Fair enough, Samuel said. And here is the thing that made her look at him a second time. He didn't ask for anything more. No wheedling for better terms. No spinning a hard luck story to soften her. He took exactly what was offered, the way an honest man takes exactly what's owed. Fair enough. 2 words, and then he set his valise down and went to work. That same afternoon he was hauling wood, hauling water, scrubbing pots until his knuckles went raw. And Agnes, who trusted no man on sight, who had watched a dozen drifters pass through that kitchen, and found every one of them wanting. Waited for the thing that always came, the sulk, the shortcut, the wounded pride of a man asked to do work he thought beneath him. It never came. He didn't act insulted by any of it. He didn't wander into her kitchen uninvited, and Agnes noticed that before she'd said a word to anyone about him. Because a man who respected the edges of a kitchen he didn't understand was worth two who didn't. He remembered where things belonged after being told once. He never made her explain the same thing twice, which, Agnes thought, was more than she could say for most men who'd ever drawn breath. By the second afternoon, something had shifted that nobody had decided on. Nobody had to point Samuel toward the next task. He found it himself, finished it, found the one after that. And Louisa, moving through her own long day, 100 small fires to put out as always, caught herself realizing she hadn't checked on him once in over an hour. She stopped when she noticed it, because that was a relief she hadn't known she'd been missing. The simple, enormous relief of not having to watch someone, of trusting a thing to be handled without her eyes on it. She hadn't felt that in longer than she wanted to admit. She filed it away. She wasn't a woman who let a good feeling make her careless. Then, 2 days in, a delivery came during the noon rush. Crates of dry goods stacked at the back door, while the dining room was full and the kitchen was roaring, and Samuel, hauling one of those crates past her, asked a question. He asked it almost without thinking, almost to himself. He asked how many suppers she usually served, between 6 and 8. And whether this delivery was sized for today, or for something bigger she saw coming. Louisa looked up from the crate she was counting, because that was not a question a man hauling wood was supposed to think to ask. That was not a wood and water question. That was a question from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with ledges in it, and forecasts, and a mind that saw a stack of crates and instantly asked what future they were meant to feed. Samuel caught the look on her face, and he went quiet. He turned back to the crates like a man who'd let something slip out of a locked drawer he hadn't meant to open. He didn't explain, he just stacked, but the question stayed in the air between them, small, unexplained, and Louisa Bennet, who did not forget things, did not forget that. So she tested him. Of course she did. The next delivery, she handed him the supplier's slip and told him to check the count himself. It was a small trap and an honest one. She wanted to see what he'd do with a number that mattered. He found the short count in 10 minutes. Nothing dramatic, just an honest mistake somewhere between the wagon and her back door. A crate that hadn't made it. But here is what he did with it, and what she was really watching for. He didn't make a show of it, didn't come puffed up with the pride of a man who'd caught something, didn't hold it over the supplier's head. He simply told her straight, the way you'd report the time of day. Louisa sorted it out with the supplier herself. Then she gave him the next count, and the one after that, without being asked twice. She wasn't handing him her trust. Not yet. She was lending it a little at a time, watching to see if any of it came back short. None of it did. That evening, the day's work finished, the reasons to keep talking, all used up. She found herself asking where he'd worked before Shoshone. Railroad camps, he said, construction sites, and then, nothing. He didn't fill the silence or build himself up. He gave her the smallest true answer and let it lie there. And something about a man who wouldn't oversell himself pulled at her more than any story could have. She didn't push. She told him, instead, that the Bennet eating house had been hers for years now, and that neither of them had any earthly reason to keep standing at that counter once the telling was done. They kept standing there anyway, a few minutes longer than the conversation needed, about nothing in particular. The town, the weather, the price of flour, nothing that matters one whit to the running of a business. And later that night, walking away from the counter, with the lamps going out behind her, Louisa could not have told you why she still remembered it. Nothing had been decided. Nothing had touched the business at all. She just found she was still thinking about it, which was not a thing that usually happened with a hired hand. 3 days into a trial. Not to her, not every. The trouble came the way trouble in a working kitchen always comes, not from a bad man, not from a lazy one, from a good idea, put in exactly the wrong place. Samuel had been watching the rear passage. He couldn't help it. It was how his mind worked. And what he saw was waste, dirty ware coming back, clean supplies going in, staff crossing through, all of it forced across the same narrow strip of floor, to a man who'd spent years shaving minutes off the feeding of 100. It was almost painful to look at. So he fixed it. He shifted the wash station 3 feet and opened a cleaner path. He didn't ask first, and for 1 hour, it was beautiful. The crossing eased, the traffic ran smooth, and Samuel let himself feel, just for that hour, the small, warm pride of a man who has quietly made something better. Then Minnie came through with an ordinary load and found her usual route blocked. She had to carry it the long way around, not at a slow hour, when it wouldn't have cost anything, but at the hour, the one that mattered. Nothing broken, nobody was hurt, but it was a real cost, small, avoidable, and entirely his doing. Louisa found him before the supper rush was even over, and she told him flat out, no cushion on it, why that route could not close. Deliveries, fuel, water, all of it threaded through that passage at a particular hour every single day. A rhythm the house had been keeping since before he ever walked through her door. A rhythm he hadn't been here nearly long enough to know. Now, here is where most men would have argued. Here is where a proud man says it worked fine at camp. Here is where the sulk finally arrives. Samuel didn't argue. He didn't reach for the campsite. He said only, quietly, that he hadn't known that part of her house. And then, he asked her a question that changed everything. What cannot move? What cannot move? Listen to what's inside those words. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't asking permission to try again. He was asking her to teach him her house, to draw the lines of the thing he'd wandered into, so he could build inside them instead of over them. And Louisa found herself doing exactly that, explaining the whole rhythm of her mornings, the deliveries, the water, the fuel, the particular hours the delicate machine depended on, more than she'd ever said to anyone about how the place actually breathed. He put the route back, then he rebuilt his whole arrangement around it, instead of through it. By the next day's services, the thing worked. The path was cleaner, and the route was open, both because he'd solved it inside the rules, instead of pretending they weren't there. Louisa left the new arrangement in place, and Samuel understood the answer without needing her to say it out loud. Something had passed between them in that, not romance, not yet, not in any word either of them would have used, something quieter, and in its way, more important. He had made a mistake in her house. She had corrected him, and instead of breaking, the thing between them had gotten stronger, and it was being built 3 feet of floor at a time by 2 people who'd both have sworn they were only talking about a wash station. The 3-day trial was nearly up. Louisa reviewed the work the way she reviewed any account, just the facts of it. He'd expected nothing past the agreed term. He was not a man who assumed his welcome outlasted his contract. She told him the 3 days had been worth paying for. That was all. No sentiment past it. And then she asked, because it was the practical thing to ask, whether he'd found other work yet. Not yet, he said. And Louisa did not ask him to stay. She wanted to. She was standing there realizing, with some alarm, that she wanted to, and she was still arguing herself out of it, still deciding what on earth she thought about that, when the door opened, and Edwin Marsh walked in with a proposition that would change the shape of the entire week. A traveler party, 24 people, bound for Shoshone Fall, needed supper, on a set evening not far off. On top of Louisa's regular trade, 24 extra suppers in one night. It would be the busiest evening the Bennett Eating House had ever attempted, and Edwin didn't want hope. He wanted a clear answer, yes or no. Now watch what Louisa did, because this is who she was. She did not turn to Samuel. She did not turn to any man. She checked with Agnes on what the kitchen could truly carry. She counted her tables. She thought of her regulars, the men who came every night, who'd built her reputation one honest supper at a time, and who would not be forgotten for a party of strangers. She checked her supply, and then she said yes. Not because she had to. She didn't need the money that badly. She said yes for the reputation of it, the referrals, the proof, the sheer want of finding out whether the Bennett Eating House could become something bigger than it already was. She said yes because she wanted to see if she could. And when she told the staff, Samuel's questions came fast and exact, one after another. Head count, arrival time, whether the party ate all at once or trickled in, how that compared to an ordinary night, how much cleanware she'd need, how many hands. Louisa stopped him, and she asked the question that had been sitting in her since the crates. Why do those questions matter so much to you? Camp work makes a man mind his numbers, he said, and went no further. But it was too late for no further. She'd heard it now, the shape of something underneath, and she was done half listening to this man. She extended his trial through the big supper, same fair terms, wage, meals, the small room, a clear end, and she made one thing plain. His growing duties would be paid duties, not favors. She would not let him drift into doing more and more for the same nothing. Then she asked him to help her count exactly what the night would need, and they leaned over the ledger together, heads closed, counting out loud, 2 voices, low, in an empty dining room, after closing, and if you had walked in just then, you would not have seen an employer and a hired hand. You'd have seen two people who fit. Over the days that followed, something changed in Samuel that made Louisa trust him more than any clever fix ever could have. He stopped assuming his instincts were enough. The man who'd moved that wash station on his own was gone. In his place was a man who watched first, who studied Louisa's rhythms, Agnes's timing, Minnie's route, the supplier's habits, before he suggested a single change. He'd learned the lesson of the rear passage, and it had stuck to his bones. He trusted the room before he trusted himself. And then Edwin came back with the party's details, and asked Samuel a question about seating that made him look at the man twice. "Were you in hotel work?" "Nah," Samuel said, and Louisa was close enough to hear it. She turned to him, fully, the way you turn to someone you have decided, right at that moment, to stop half listening to forever. Then, she said, "What kind of railroad work put those questions in your head?" There was no room left to dodge it gently, and Samuel finally told her he'd been a commissary clerk for a railroad contractor. And here is what those flat little words actually meant. Once he let them out, he had counted the provisions that kept a construction camp alive. Every pound of flour, every side of bacon, everything in and everything out. He had kept the head count straight when 100 men or more had to be fed on schedule. In the hardest weather the mountains could throw, weather that didn't wait on anyone's excuses. And then, quietly, he told her about the winter. One winter, the supply wagon had broken an axle 2 days out. 2 days out in the cold with a camp full of men who worked like animals and ate like it, and Samuel had stretched 3 days of flour into five without one man going hungry enough to complain. Not a manager did that. Not an engineer. Not one of the men whose names went on the reports. Just the clerk, the man who kept the numbers honest when nobody else had the time or the care. Louisa was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Why didn't you say so the day you walked in?" And Samuel's answer was the saddest, truest thing he'd said yet. "After enough men tell you there's no opening for that," he said, "you stop leading with it. You learn to ask smaller. Let that sit." A man who had kept 100 alive through a mountain winter, and the world had taught him to ask only for wood and water, because the full truth of himself kept getting doors shut in his face. And something in the way Louisa looked at him afterward had changed. Not surprised, exactly, more like a picture finally coming into focus after being blurred the whole time. The tired man with the valise, the strange question, the honest short cunt, what cannot move, all of it snapping together into one clear image at last. She did not hand him her whole operation. That was not who she was, and it was not what respect looked like. She drew the lines instead, clean and clear. Samuel would take the country, the receiving, the helper sequence, the table turnover, the timing. Agnes kept the kitchen, full authority, no question. And Louisa kept the customers, the prices, the suppliers, and the final word on absolutely everything. His pay would reflect the wider duty. He agreed without arguing a single line. Later, the practical business settled, the ledger closed, the count was finished, and the reasons to stay were gone. And neither of them moved from the counter. Louisa asked him, not about the restaurant, not about anything that mattered to the business, what he missed eating from the camps. He thought about it far longer than the question seemed to need, then named something small and ordinary, a dish tied to one particular cold morning, with one particular crew. Years gone now. He didn't turn it into a story or reach for her sympathy. He just answered her the way he did everything. Then he asked what she'd put on her menu, if she never once had to think about the cost. "Fresh peaches," she said, "when they're good enough to be worth the trouble." Samuel's mouth softened. "That sounds like an expensive answer." "You asked me not to think about the cost," she said, "so I didn't." And the ease of it surprised her more than anything he'd said all night. She was not a woman who was easy with people. She'd built a whole life on not being easy with people. Samuel looked down at the closed ledger like he'd near forgotten it was there. "Peaches, then," he said. "Only if somebody else is paying." And that got the smallest laugh out of him. Barely a laugh at all. But Louisa heard it, and she found herself smiling before she'd decided whether she meant to. Not everyone was won over so gently. Agnes gave him one more lesson, and didn't bother making it kind. She said no to a sequence that would have crowded one kitchen step too tight, told him flat what her stoves could carry, and watched him revise his whole plan around her limit instead of past it. Louisa watched him take it without one flicker of bruised pride, and thought, there it is again. Most men would rather be right than be corrected. This one would rather the food went out hot. And Owen Morrow, a local freight man, happened by with a shipment and watched Samuel reconcile two accounts at once. The restaurant's stock and the traveler party's allotment, sorted clean in a fraction of the time it would have taken most men. Owen asked where a man learned that kind of care. Samuel told him straight. Owen didn't offer him a thing. He just listened and remembers the way a man remembers a name worth keeping for later. The night before the big supper, the last count finished. Agnes and Minnie already gone home. Louisa noticed something. Samuel didn't ask, what work have you got for me anymore? He said, tomorrow we'll need from inside the work now, not outside it. Not a hired hand awaiting orders. A man standing in the middle of the thing, seeing it whole. And she noticed something else. She trusted him enough now to disagree with him, to say no, that won't do, without feeling like she'd handed him the whole burden and taken it back. That's a specific kind of trust. The kind between partners. There was a quiet between them that didn't need filling. Two people, an empty dining room, the lamps low, and nothing that needed saying. Neither of them said it. The day of the supper, the whole house moved with a controlled kind of pressure. Everyone had their piece of it memorized. Samuel checked the helper movements twice, more habit than doubt now. Then Edwin arrived, with a change nobody had planned for. 6 more travelers had joined the party overnight. 24 had become 30, and Edwin needed to know now, right now, whether Louisa could still take them. And what happened? Samuel did not answer for her. Agnes gave her kitchen's real limit. Samuel gave the operational cost of the 6 straight, no softening, and Louisa did the arithmetic in her own head, fast, and said yes. Then Samuel, before he touched a single arrangement, turned to Louisa and Agnes, and asked the question he'd learned in that rear passage weeks ago. What cannot move? And this time, she answered fast. Without having to think, because she trusted, now, all the way to the bone, that he would actually listen to the answer, instead of working around it. He rebuilt the whole sequence around what she told him, quietly, without needing to be watched doing it. The first part of supper held, not perfect, nothing that size ever is, but it held. The regular tables got their food only a little slower than usual. Agnes kept the kitchen steady, plate after plate going out the pass, without a break in the rhythm. Samuel kept his eyes everywhere at once. The empty chairs, the clean ware, the line still at the door, and then the extra 6 caught up with them. Dirty ware came back faster than clean ware could be made ready. Steam and noise thickened in the narrow rear passage until you could barely see across it. A helper got stuck between clearing and resetting, a tray in both hands. Nowhere clear to set it down, frozen in the crush. 2 tables waited longer than they'd been promised, and a regular, one of Louisa's own, one of the men who'd kept her lamps lit through every ordinary night, asked her, and not gently, whether the traveler party had swallowed the whole room. Louisa had seconds, not minutes, seconds to decide, and this was the moment everything had been building towards. Not the romance, the proof. A man can say he kept 100 fed through a winter. Saying it is easy, now, in a jammed passage, with the steam rising and a promise breaking, and her whole reputation tilting on its edge. Now she'd see it. Samuel found the choke point in seconds. Not with a list running in his head, not with panic. He read the room the way a man reads a place he has finally learned by heart. Every crossing, every country, every hand, and where it should be. He pulled one helper straight off carrying, and put her on to clearing. He held the next seating back 3 full minutes. 3. Exactly, no guess in it. So the clean ware could catch up, and he told Louisa precisely how much delay he could honestly recover. Not a hopeful number, an honest one, so that when she made her promise to the front room, the promise would mean something. The backlog stopped growing, and then slowly, then not slowly, it started to shrink, and in the very middle of the worst of it, dishes still stacking, Agnes calling something from the kitchen, the whole night balanced on a knife's edge. Louisa looked for him, not to check his work. She was past checking his work, just to see him. His cuff was damp to the elbow. His collar had come open at the throat. He was moving fast, faster than she'd ever seen him move. And not once, did he look rattled. He looked like a man, exactly where he was meant to be. And for 1 full second, in the middle of a room full of people waiting on both of them, Louisa Bennet forgot the room. She forgot the party and the regulars and the promise and the counter. She just looked at him. Then she caught herself, and she turned back to the front before he could notice. A woman who had never in her life let herself be caught looking at anything she couldn't afford. The last traveler tables were served. The regulars had not been abandoned. One honest apology, owed for the delay. Nothing worse, and Samuel wasn't scanning the room for anyone's praise. He was finishing his account, checking the last table's turn, the same as any other night. That was almost the most remarkable thing about him. He just saved the biggest night the house had ever seen. And he was counting plates. Afterward, Edwin asked him where a man learned to hold a service together under that kind of count, and Samuel answered without shrinking. It down the way he used to. No hedging, no, just a clerk. He told him plainly what he was, and what he'd done. Edwin listened. Then he said that when Samuel's time at the Bennett eating house was finished, he wanted him to come talk about paid work, separately, quietly, and Ruth Whitcomb, watching the room empty, leaned toward Louisa and asked, lightly, the way anyone might ask about any capable stranger passing through a small town, "Is that man married?" An ordinary question, idle, kind, even, but Louisa felt it land somewhere she hadn't braced for. Sharper than she'd have believed idle curiosity could land, because the man who'd walked in less than 2 weeks earlier, hat in his hand, asking if anyone had any work at all. That man was now a man other people were beginning to seek out. Edwin wanted him, Owen wanted him, and now Ruth was looking at him and asking a question that had nothing to do with dishes, and Louisa found that she minded far more than she'd have predicted an hour before, if anyone had thought to ask her. Later, once the room had gone quiet, Louisa watched Samuel finish the last of the count. There was no reason left to watch him. The night's work was done. The books would keep till morning. She watched anyway, and standing there, she found herself picturing something she didn't want to picture. Samuel working for Owen, Samuel eating his supper somewhere else in Shoshone, Samuel known to people who had nothing at all to do with her restaurant. A whole life continuing on, out past her own front door, whether she was any part of it or not. She almost asked him, right then, what time he'd be back tomorrow. And then she remembered his trial was nearly finished. There might not be a tomorrow that was any of her business at all. The thought landed harder than she let her face show. The next day, she closed the account properly, because that was who she was all the way through. She counted out every wage Samuel had earned across the whole arrangement, coin by coin, onto the counter between them, and set the little book aside once the sum was exactly right. No soft words, no speech about him having earned more than money could cover, though heaven knew she was thinking it. She thanked him for the work, simply, and he took it the same way, folding it away without counting it back, because he trusted her count. Of course he did. They'd spent 2 weeks learning to trust each other's numbers, and that, it turned out, was its own kind of love letter, written in a language only the two of them could read. The small room stayed his through the time already agreed, and with part of his pay, he began, quietly, asking after a room of his own, somewhere else in town. A few days on, Samuel sat down with Owen Morrow. The offer was real. Paid work, keeping supply records, and receiving straight for Owen's freight business. And Samuel asked his terms the way he always had. Wages, duties, start date. Who held the final say? Then he accepted, because the work was real, and because, at last, it met him at the level he actually knew. No more asking smaller, no more folding the best of himself into a coat pocket. Somebody finally wanted the whole man. He arranged a simple room of his own, away from the Bennett eating house, and then he came back to tell Louisa himself. The new work, the new lodging, the day he'd clear the small room and be gone from her back passage for good. She was glad for him, honestly, truly glad, and it cost her something to hear it that cleanly, precisely because she no longer had any claim on him at all. She had wanted good things for him from the start. Now that they'd come, she had to stand there and be happy about the very thing that was taking him out of her days. And she gave him that gladness whole. The days after ran on 2 separate tracks. Samuel started at Owen's, Louisa kept running her restaurant, and a follow-up inquiry from the traveler party's supper proved that the growth she'd gambled on was real. Neither of their futures needed the other to hold together anymore. And that is the thing you have to understand about what came next. This was not 2 people clinging to each other out of need. He had his work, she had hers. Each of them was whole, which meant whatever happened between them now would happen for one reason only. Not need, not convenience, not a warm room, and a wage want. One evening after closing, the late summer light going gold across the street, the whole town gone soft and slow in its, Louisa stepped out and saw Samuel outside the Mercantile, and she called his name before she could think of a single practical reason not to. That was the miracle of it. Louisa Bennett, who had a practical reason for everything, calling his name into the gold light, with no reason at all except that she wanted to. "Would you walk with me?" she said, "before the light goes?" And Samuel understood exactly what she was asking. This was not about a delivery or the cunt. This was the question underneath every other question they'd been not asking for 2 weeks. He said yes, and as they started to walk, he took his hat off. The same motion, the very same motion from the day he'd first come through her door, hat in his hand, asking for wood and water and a place to sleep. Louisa noticed. She didn't say so. They walked, and they talked about ordinary things. Nothing dressed up for the occasion, nothing rehearsed. He asked where she'd grown up, and she told him, a smaller town, further south, nothing like Shoshone. She asked whether he'd ever thought about settling anywhere in particular before all this, and he admitted, quietly, that he hadn't let himself think that far ahead in years, because wanting a fixed place and not getting it was the harder thing. And after a while, Samuel asked her the question he'd been carrying since the first afternoon. "Did you think me trouble that first day I came through your door, Taya?" Louisa said, "That wasn't what I asked." She looked at him, and a corner of her mouth went up. "A little trouble." Then he smiled, and she smiled back, and it was, Louisa thought, walking in the last of that gold light beside a man who counted honest and asked smaller, and had saved her restaurant while checking the plates. The simplest conversation she'd had in months. And somehow, she already knew the one she would remember the longest. Near the end of it, Samuel asked whether he might see her again on his next free evening. Yes, Louisa said, the same way she said most things, without ceremony, already half turning back toward the lit windows of her own restaurant, the place she'd built, the place that was hers, the life she'd made with her own 2 hands, and would never once set down for anybody. A woman with a place of her own, and now somewhere else she wanted to be. Shoshone was a real railroad town in Idaho Territory in the year 1888. Louisa Bennett, Samuel Reed, the Bennett Eating House, and the events of this story are fictional. The narration and imagery were created with AI. He walked in asking for almost nothing. Wood, water, washing, a place to sleep. He'd learned to fold the best of himself away in a coat pocket because the world kept shutting doors on the whole of him. And by the end of the busiest night that little restaurant had ever seen, the entire shape of his future had changed. Not because he finally learned to boast, but because one woman was patient enough and sharp enough to see the whole man behind the small asp. So tell me, which moment made you see him differently? Was it the short count, told plain, the winter he stretched 3 days of flour into 5, the 3 minutes he held the seating, honest to the second, or the hate coming off his head one more time in the gold evening light? Tell me below. I read them, and if you want another original frontier romance like this one, a story where the quiet ones turn out to be the ones worth waiting for, subscribe to USA West Stories. There's a new one waiting for you. Thank you for spending this evening in Shoshone with Louisa and Samuel. Now go get some rest.